Thank you for joining us for our first in a series of some really exciting webinars. We are representing the Maryland Online Leadership Institute today. My name is Jessica Young. I am the director of the Institute, and sadly we had to cancel our residential program for this year, but in its place we have invited some very phenomenal speakers to be our featured guests for our webinars. Today we will start with the Uncharted Waters webinar series. Dr. James Fielder, our Maryland Higher Education Secretary, is here to share his perspective on the broader scope of what leadership looked like through our recent catastrophic transition, as I would call it. And we also have Dr. Charlene Dukes, president of PG County Community College. She's been in higher education for 30 years, and hearing her institutional perspective is going to give us a unique and dynamic conversation. We also have Dr. Rhonda Fentry as our moderator. She has been in, I met her several years ago as my mentor from another leadership institute, and she is phenomenal in the way she rose to her position now as a CIO at PG County, but she is going to lead the way with the questions today. This session will be recorded. I do ask that if you have questions along the way that you type them into the chat. We have reserved some time at the end for the questions itself, and we do ask that you remain on mute throughout the dialogue so that our featured speakers have time to answer the questions that they were given. I'll send it off to you, Rhonda.
Thank you, Jessica. Good afternoon, Secretary Fielder, Dr. Dukes, and the Maryland Online and Mali community. I'm honored to moderate this discussion today on a topic that none of us could have imagined 4 to 6 months ago would be necessary. So the goal of today's session is for the panelists to provide their unique perspective on the extraordinary events of the past 12 weeks, which have indeed resulted in or will result in uncharted waters for higher education, which are the ongoing impact of the coronavirus pandemic and the protests of racial inequality on higher education, Maryland, and across the country. We have some prepared questions, but we really want this to be a dialogue and a conversation between the panelists. So if we could start, maybe a good place to start with some reflections on the past 12 weeks. Secretary Fielder, Dr. Dukes, how would you summarize the past 12 weeks, what we've been through?
Good morning. I would find it tumultuous, exciting, anxious. I mean, any of the verbs that describe levels of emotion also fit in here. Some of it could be almost described with the latest racial unrest as what you go through with the grieving process, from anger and sadness and grief and overwhelming, what are we going to do now? But if you take 12 to 15 weeks ago and say, where are we now as compared to where we were, as Rhonda has already put so well, an unbelievable change, more innovation in the past 12 weeks in higher education than I've seen in my entire time in higher ed. It goes back to mid-80s. It's extraordinary, the ability of people to embrace the sense of urgency that was required, as we all, and I'll turn to Dr. Dukes in just a second, think of the professionals who've been faculty members and administrators for 20 years. 3 months ago or 6 months ago, if you'd said, okay, I want you to go online, do everything online from your house, the answer was no, or what? You want me to do what? And then we'll figure out the funding later. And that was always a really uneasy feeling for the administrator side. So it's just been extraordinary to see the advances which have tremendous impact on access and success for all students. So, and President Dukes, for those who don't know you, don't know her, have been just an outstanding example of crisis communication, which we can talk on a little bit later, that understands that that's the route forward. So with that, Dr. Dukes.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here with us this morning. I think that it's caused all of us to think about things in ways that are so different from what we are used to in higher education. Most of us know that we are used to coming to a set of buildings on a small or large campus, that we have face-to-face classes, we engage with students in a face-to-face kind of perspective, and we're used to leaning on each other within our work environments. And I would say that Jim used a number of what I would call 11 letter words. I was going to use 1 4-letter words. It was the transition from you know where. But I think that happened for all of us. How did we think differently? How did we turn around on a dime? For us at Prince George's Community College, it was really canceling spring break for the majority of administrators and department chairs and key faculty leaders, key staff leaders, and then extending spring break for students for another week so we could do some what we call just-in-time training. Probably 70–80% of our classes were offered in a face-to-face environment across 5 locations, including a main campus. And then we had credit programs and continuing education programs. And what did that mean as we thought about how do we deliver this and how do we understand how we serve not just the students who come to us in either one of those credit or continuing education environments, but how do we ensure that we're serving our colleagues? The things that we discovered that, quite frankly, in the 42 years, thank you, it's been a little longer than 30, but in the 42 years that I've been in higher education and in this technological environment in which we teach and learn, there were things that never occurred to me. It never occurred to me that we would have employees who didn't have internet. You know, we talk a lot about access and equity for students, but we don't talk a lot about access and equity for the people with whom we work every day. That their work environment was truly only at the location where they physically arrived every day. So what did that mean and what did it look like and how could we ensure that we maintained a level of service to students and a level of service to each other? And I think as I end this, the other thing that we've learned is that we are much more resilient than we believe we are, and that we are much more willing to come together collaboratively and cooperatively than maybe might have been the case had we been in our own physical environment. So the opportunity for transformation and innovation and the role of education, these are the discussions that we should be having now, not just about COVID-19 and all that it has brought to us, but also about the social unrest that is going on across our country. And what does it mean for higher education to lean in more, given that we say we educate for a just and equitable society.
Thank you. Thank you. That was awesome. I was jotting down some notes, and when I think about some of the things, and there was a lot in that sort of opening statement, and thank you for that. Is some of the things that I jotted down which resonated with me, and I'm certain with our audience, are one was innovation, opportunity, access, and change. And when we think about all of those things, in some regard, it's maybe not how people would have described higher education prior to this. And so I think it's really want to spend some more time talking about some of those things. Secretary Fielder said there were some things that we never do. And we have a joke where we say, you know, higher ed, we have our never list. Never work remote, never all of our courses online, never have students that wouldn't come to campus. And this has really turned on its head all of sort of the list of nevers that we had as sort of a sector, an industry. But as we think about other industries, some of the best of those industries come out of disruption, comes out of these kinds of challenges. So one question, a follow-up question that I would like to ask is, as we think about all of the sort of change and innovation, which of these innovations do we think this will persist Do we think if we go back to campus or would things ever go back to normal? And how can we continue to leverage and build upon sort of all the good that's going to come out of this?
Well, I do believe that Dr. Dukes hit on one of the most important. It's the ability of us to increasingly become flexible and nimble and to embrace the diversity that this brings. So many of us were raised in believing that it was very clear that you never take home to work and you never take work home. But guess what? In 3 weeks, everybody had to work from home. And that's the same for students. So the challenges for the students that may or may not be in the best environment for learning, is tremendously magnified. Well, it's the same way for faculty and staff. And as Dr. Dukes indicated, I think there's always the assumption, well, staff and faculty already have a full office at home with support necessary to do whatever they have to do. And the short answer is many didn't. So one of the things that happened months ago now, it seems like longer, was to try to collect the information from the institutions of the identification of costs, new costs that had not been on the books before, not just the costs on masks and PPE and so forth, interconnectivity costs. Some of our community colleges that are in more remote locations don't have the access to internet. So they had to create ways to do hotspots in a bus, in a parking lot. I mean, all these kinds of things, the students that didn't have the connectivity, either because they physically didn't have a phone or a laptop, it changes everything about higher ed. It also makes higher ed be more responsive and actually provides the opportunity now that the interconnectivity and dependence upon each institution has increased. Faculty and students now see a very bright line of communication needs that they may not have seen before. And I know that's true for us in higher ed in terms of what we're trying to do. A week ago, we sent out 137,000 email blasts and texts to students regarding their student financial aid. Well, that, of course, it's like a food fight. You throw the first set of olives, you get 20 back, then you have to throw 40, then you have to, well, anyway, the bottom line is it brings a tremendous amount of interconnection. And it's not just the interconnection through the technology, it also personalizes something, just as this Zoom does this morning, to see people's faces and have direct communication that I would normally not have had. It is both refreshing and challenging at the same time. So there's a tremendous just an absolute tremendous opportunity for higher education, and incumbent upon all of us in leadership positions to step up on inclusion, to step up on diversity, to step up on embracing, not through words, but through actions. What are we going to really do to change higher education? We say, well, we're going to increase accessibility. How do you increase accessibility to students who do not have technology? How do you identify the students? How do you fund the technology? Is it through a federal or state program on broadband? Is it a focus on some new technology on hotspots? Well, it's all those things. Yet each one of us at whatever level in higher ed has that, I believe, individual responsibility. We have to do this.
You know, what I think about are a couple of things. One is what we've learned from this, and what we've learned vis-a-vis the way we hire. What kind of credentials ought we to be thinking about, whether it's staff, faculty, administrators, that we have to have individuals at the college who are now much more flexible than maybe we would have ever had before. So that to hire someone to believe that he or she is only going to work from a physical location on a campus, but they are going to work in some way both physically and at a remote location, which could be home now and not necessarily, you know, Panera Bread or someplace where you can go in and they have all of these, you know, internet and everything available for you. Also think about faculty credentials as we think about that. How are we hiring faculty for the future who can move easily between face-to-face and online courses, and truly online courses, not the kind of remote instruction that we hopefully will only be in relative to when we stopped in March. And maybe as we think about what the future of higher education is, we know that we've done that for March, the end of to the end of the spring semester, and summer. Fall should look very different for our students if we're going to remain in a remote teaching and learning posture. How comfortable are faculty and staff with using the kinds of tools that are available to us, no matter what your learning management system is? What ought we to be saying to students now about the kinds of devices that they should have, and what the specifications ought to be in case we're always having to pivot between these two types of instruction, which really should be, in my mind, for the future, it has to be face-to-face and asynchronous, that students have to be able to get the fullness thereof if they're going to be in an online environment. And many of you know what this is because you know that that is the work that you do and the service that you provide for us. I think it's also about pre-K through 20. I don't believe that we can think solely about community colleges and four-year colleges and universities. We have to think about what is the collaboration, what is the partnership, and how we are engaging in the pre-K through 20 space, because things have changed for them. And what students will expect when they come to us is really what they will become accustomed to in this new environment that they're experiencing, whether it's a public pre-K through 20 or our non-public private institutions that proliferate across the state of Maryland and beyond. It's going to require presidents and leadership teams to think very differently, to rearrange maybe the constitution of our budgets and where we put the predominance of our resources. Most of us say we put that in teaching and learning, but we're also going to have to say, how does that impact enterprise technology, and how we're ensuring that we have the kind of technology that is available, easy to use, easy to access. I think that that's critically important. What is it that we're saying to employees? If you're going to be in a remote work environment, then what is it that you ought to have as part of that? That you should have a reliable internet service. You know, that you should have either specific equipment, or what will the college provide you as a result of this? I don't know that we can ever look backwards, and I'll share with you something I said to the team at Prince George's, is that I've been in this business now 42 years, and education is learning. There's no question about it. And it is also a business, because we've got to manage budgets and look at enrollments and all of those kind of things that sometimes we think are peripheral to the work, but they actually help us to engage in the work. That as a student affairs professional, because I came up through student affairs, that you could never have told me on March the 1st that we could transition everyone to a remote work environment and students would get that same kind of touch and engagement. I would have gone to my grave saying that doesn't happen. Today, I think very differently, and it only took 6 weeks for me to change my mind about that. I also think that we ought to be thinking about how we engage with what I call, should internet now become a utility, as opposed to, if you can afford it along with your cable bill or anything else, that you have access to something that is going to change the world. So just like we pay you know, BGE or Pepco for electricity, or Washington Gas, that's what's in my neck of the woods, then should we look at that now potentially as a utility? And where does that begin? At the federal government, at the state government, as opposed to having any number of companies that we can go back and forth with around the cost of our internet service? I think that will help when we talk about broadband across Maryland or across the region.
Great. Secretary Fielder, did you want to respond to anything Dr. Duke said, or I have another follow-up question?
No, I think that what she has identified is so tremendously accurate. When you think about the new avenue of communication, 20 years ago, if somebody said we were going through this pandemic, higher ed would have basically ceased. There wasn't cell phone. There wasn't the access to internet. Some of us may have had it, but it was rare. And so all of a sudden we're thrust into a tremendous new form of communication that 3 and 4-year-olds start with. So I think you're absolutely right that it needs to be treated differently so that access is not limited to geography or economics. And right now both have a tremendous impact.
Thank you. So you each have identified sort of a lot of things that would need to happen or how we can really leverage this opportunity. So one question that was submitted was, what are the leadership characteristics that you see as being needed to really sort of shepherd us through this for the long term of higher education? And if you could give some specific examples of what that would look like.
Sure. I think that we talk about, well, you have to manage a crisis. Everybody on this call knows you have to lead a crisis. You can't simply manage it. You have to engage versus endure. So as a leader on a campus, the whole aspect of communication, that it's clear, concise, and specific and timely, that you have to honor the sense of urgency. And for some staff members, you have to create a sense of urgency so that they, in fact, engage in the solution versus, I can just outwait this. I don't have to sign on. I don't have to learn to teach online. I'll just wait. Well, that doesn't work in a crisis. In a crisis, the sense of urgency dictates that decisions are made rapidly. And with the understanding that if you made a bad decision, like if you start in a port, you go one direction and it's the wrong direction, you quickly change. You don't go back to port, you change the direction of your ship. Well, leadership is the same way in a crisis situation. As soon as you realize, oh crap, sorry, I made a bad decision, well, you fix it, you make another decision. And it's that type of leadership that we see. I mean, you can look at the United States, you can look at the states that are making good decisions and bad decisions right now, and it's literally costing people their lives. So that when I think of communication, urgency, specific, clear, timely, engaged, and the understanding that the engagement and to ensure responsiveness, team members can't isolate themselves. Right. They can't pretend that I don't need to respond because somebody else will take care of it. And those individuals you need to identify as soon as you can and sit with them and help them understand what you really need, so that the framework for communications, and now that we've moved so much into online electronic communications, email chains, you can see is one email you send to 14 people with an expectation. Does that person send it to another 15 people that report to them? So that the chain of communication is much cleaner in some ways. It also can be used like this, chat room here to gather input from people you normally would not gather information from because of the hierarchy of your organization, whether it's a corporation, an institution, or state government bureaucracy. I hear from all my staff members at whatever level with suggestions and recommendations. I do hear occasionally, well, Jim, you did it wrong. And that's okay. because that's part of what we've got to do, especially when we're trying to lead through this pandemic, and now the racial unrest. They've compounded some things, and it should not make us timid. It should not make us timid. Actions need to occur, and we need to move forward. So the processes, procedures, objectives, goals, all those things, the clearer you can make them when you're communicating in a crisis, the better. People need to know what the expectations are. I mean, the worst thing is you go to the doctor and the doctor says, well, we've run all these tests and what? Well, I'll tell you next week. No, I don't want to know next week. I want to know now. And some of what we're doing right now in higher ed, especially with the pandemic, is we don't know the answer. So one of the chat room questions I saw was, you know, what do you do when you don't have all the answers? You communicate clearly, transparently. You can tell people, I don't have an answer. I'm gathering the information. And as soon as we have an answer, we can move forward. So I just think that the transparency that this communication type now can lend could be very advantageous for us.
I think flexibility and agility is important across the entire spectrum of an institution, that we can't afford to cross our arms and say, well, we'll wait and see what they say. So then what we can do is tear it apart. That people have to be willing to have open lines of communication, to be empathetic in the process. You know, I know that what we're dealing with on all of our campuses, and I know we're dealing with it nationally because I'm on a number of listservs that, quite frankly, everyone is concerned about coming back to a physical location. At the same time, as at least college leadership, we know that we can't mothball buildings forever. That we are going to have to learn how to deal with this virus, as we have so many others in the past, that we can't always wait for the vaccination. But what we can do is have a series of guiding principles and procedures around how we will keep people as safe as possible, how we will have as few people on our campuses and our buildings as possible while we're working through all of this. And the important thing is that we keep employees certainly at the top of the priority list, and we keep students there as well. It's not one or the other. And how do we lean in more to listen, to learn, but also expect others to lean in? As we're communicating through technological means, there's a responsibility to read it, to not just wait for it to be regurgitated back to you. And then clearly, with the professionals that we have on this webinar today, then you probably know more about this work than most presidents do. How do you lean in to help us as we think about what does it mean to work in this environment, to have all the tools, or at least the requisite tools that are necessary in order for this to occur? You know, I think about the things that keep me up at night, and I think, how are we going to pay for this? How are we going to make sure that everyone has what he or she needs? When do we say no to a specific thing, but yes to another thing? How does that help us to move our goals and objectives and aspirations for our students and each other forward? Who am I going to tick off, you know, around this? Because somebody, and most people don't have a problem telling you when they think you're doing the wrong thing. You know, sometimes I say, I'd like to hear just a little more often that was a great decision, and here's how we believe that we can be helpful in implementation around that kind of thing. You know, this particular pandemic has made us think, I think, both individually and collectively around how we move our institution forward, while also remaining empathetic to the individual concerns that we have about all of this and what it means to each one of us from a perspective of health, safety, our families, et cetera, et cetera.
Right, thank you. So one of the things that is coming out of this pandemic is that the role of online education, right? So in this quick pivot transition, online education, and just as a long-time online Maryland Online, board member and former chair of MOL. Maryland Online was born out of an initiative to expand online education across the state of Maryland. I've been at Prince George's Community College for 17 years and engaged with MOL for about that long. And even 17 years later, we still, yes, we all are engaging in online education, but we still are talking about faculty who were not prepared, students who were not prepared to learn in this way, faculty who were not prepared to teach in this way. So given what we've seen as a result of this pandemic, how can we talk about the role and maybe investment of online education moving forward? And how do we do this for real? I mean, we've been doing it, but we've been kind of nibbling and our toe is in the water. But how do we really do online education in Maryland moving forward?
Well, I think we have to jump into the water. That's number one. I think with Secretary Fielder, it's an opportune time for a work group that can present recommendations to the legislative body. If there are if we can do some things around some grants that are really huge amounts of money that would allow us to say, what is at least a minimum standard that every higher education institution in the state of Maryland, where they should be as a minimum. And then what does that mean as you continue sort of up that ladder of progression? What's a minimum standard? What's a maximum standard? How can we help each other with training? Because every institution has been doing this, I would dare say, individually, as opposed to thinking collectively. And when we don't have a minimum standard, it doesn't even allow us to think collectively around this work and how we can leverage resources to do it, both those internal to our own institutions and those where we might be able to encourage both the office of the governor and the legislative body, the General Assembly, to think about education differently. And I think we have to be partners with K-12. We know that in the state of Maryland, that is where the bulk of the dollars for education, they go from our local budgets and meaning our local county budgets, and then certainly up through the state process. Why? Because number one, there are more young people engaged in pre-K through 12. It is also pre-K through 12, that's a constitutional right. When you think about post-secondary education, in many ways, it's those who have the money to pursue it are those who have the benefit of what that really means. So I think we have to think about it differently, and I would dare say you all have to be thinking about this. Rhonda, you brought up something that actually I was going to respond to. I remember the creation of Maryland Online, and that quite frankly, I would expect that MOL at this point ought to be the leading and driving force around this and forcing us as presidents to think about this differently, because we have to now think about how we serve differently and how we educate differently.
What I would say that's a tremendous insight. It's kind of interesting whether it's because I'm getting close to lunchtime or not. Maryland Online and online education was kind of like the icing on the cake. Going forward, it has to be the main course. We have to have it in institutional budgets. And if you do any review of how does an institution respond to a period of fiscal stringency, the first thing that's looked at is, where do I cut? Well, I really don't need that new hardware. The software, we can do a patch and I can put it off for 3 years. And the training of the staff on how to use that, we'll get to that later. So even though Oracle and PeopleSoft and Microsoft were installed on campuses, there was not the budget to support all the training of the staff on how to fully use it and implement it. And I think we're learning from those lessons right now at those institutions that had spent money and planned to start doing hybrid. And many of them were doing it as, how do I save some of my HR costs? And they were starting to examine other ways to deliver courses. And I can tell you, in my 5 years with the state at MHEC, it's been interesting. 5 years ago, starting out and saying, well, we need to see if we can do some collaboration here and have two institutions work together, even in an online capacity, shared teaching appointments, shared content. And the answer was, no, we're not interested. Well, I tell you right now, I think there's much more understanding of that's not only an interest, it's a need. Because if we look out across the United States, and I'm sure all of you have read some of the big concerns institutions are planning from, if some of the 4 years decreases in enrollment, and community college is planning for the increases in enrollment. Well, either way, you've got a swing there of how do you do it? And right now, that's a little bit of an unknown. So when we talk about the need, the urgency to be nimble, to be quick, the online education, and I was going to ask yourselves, with your online, Maryland Online, how many institutions came to you for training for their faculty and staff? How many reached out immediately and said, you know what? We really need to do this. We can't just make this assumption that Jim Fielder knows how to start teaching online. He's great in person, but, and I don't know the answer to that. I was curious about that, as I would think that there would be much more profound need for how do you deliver quality education and consistency of what you've advertised on your website. Some four-year institutions on their website and community colleges welcome students to a bright, lit, safe environment. I mean, that's one thing. Well, if the campuses are not going to be in person, what are you saying to the parents who are saying, I want a tuition reduction because my son or daughter isn't going to be at the campus, they're going to be online at home? So there's all these questions that'll be coming up within 90 days as we try to get back open.
And I think that as I look at, because I'm also looking at the chat box, Rhonda, just so you know, and I think that from Shanita to Larry Reagan to Debbie Ezell, if I'm pronouncing the names correctly, that there are some good points here. How do we come together? How does Maryland Online, quite frankly, I think, lift its presence and its voice for the environment in which we find ourselves, sending us a series of recommendations. You all know what's going on at your own institutions because you represent almost every institution in the state of Maryland, sending us recommendations about what are minimal standards for technology and technology platforms, no matter which one you use. Is there a need to be thinking cross-collaboratively around how we're doing this work, around training, and not just training of faculty, but what do we want to do relative to training of students who've never taught in learned in an online environment? What should they know about this? How do you look at our websites and actually give us a grade on our website around what kind of information are you providing to students? What kind of online orientation, or what kind of orientation are you doing relative to this new remote online environment? And I think, Larry, you made a comment about even the differences in format. I will not have Rhonda tell you how many times I said, okay, explain this to me again, and I want you to be really clear. What does synchronous, asynchronous, hybrid, what does that mean, not only in terms of a formal definition, but what is the experience that students ought to be getting in those environments, and what is the experience that faculty ought to be delivering? And the same thing as we talk about advising for students, financial aid for students. What are the experiences that we should be giving them so that when they end that call or end that teaching session, that they feel like they've gotten everything that they could have to the extent that we would have done it in a face-to-face environment. Now, we know that there are some differences, but I think even, and I understand quality matters and all of those, the relationships that existed and where they are now, but how do you force us to also think about things differently?
Okay. Thank you so much for that. One of the questions in the chat that I was going to make reference to, and then Dr. Dukes did, and this is this idea of what are the different types of online instruction. And we talk about, so really there's this dichotomy between fully on campus, which is traditional sort of teaching and learning. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have online teaching and learning. And really the question is it ever, do we ever go back to sort of these polar opposites, or is the new normal sort of on that continuum, and that even though when COVID gods come and take the pandemic away from us forever, that maybe we always would have some variation on this continuum that recognizes that, you know, faculty, staff, students have needs. And I think some of this is what so the intent of online education in many ways was to expand access to education. And maybe our first version of it was in a very specific way of fully online. So can this pandemic now bring us to another version of access that is along a continuum? What do we think that could look like?
Well, I can speak a little bit to it. I'm trying to monitor nationally what different states are doing with their guidelines and so forth. And there seems to be, for the Chronicle reporting, that 2/3 or 66% of the institutions they've been monitoring, over 1,800, are planning to return to in-person type in the fall, yet also supporting both hybrid and then, you know, online or distance education. So I was told by somebody last week that I should not be saying online, I should be saying distance learning. So these are different vocabularies changing as we're speaking, and hybrid has different meanings at each institution. I can tell you from our point of view, meaning MHEC's point of view, we've had a number of institutions that have requested, you know, even in spring semester, to be able to do some hybrid, meaning that whatever they could teach online or distance learning, they would do online. Yet that there were specific disciplines, courses, and labs, clinicals, that needed to be done in person. And how could they do that? So then you get into all the social distancing, the masks, and so forth. Yet at the same time, moving forward into the fall, we have institutions ranging from in-person, you know, with distance, to hybrid, meaning part of the course will be online, part of the course will be in person, and then some institutions that are strictly saying we're going to maintain the off-campus point of view. So going forward, I don't think there is any, quote, return to normal, because normalcy was, was abnormal for some people even then. And I think what we need to do is say, you know, where are we? And understanding that both for faculty, staff, and students, we have to be nimble. We have to stay focused on providing student success, access to, which means some students will need to have equipment purchased for them and provided the learning that goes with, well, how do I do it? So there's many new challenges for higher ed institutions than there were a year ago.
I think we also have to be willing to be really upfront and candid about where we are, where we could do better, and where we are just failing miserably. And what does that mean? And what does it look like? And again, I go back to what are minimum standards and what are maximum standards. You know, that at a minimum, everyone who is engaging in this new way of teaching and learning and servicing ought to have this. And what is the professional development that we can provide inside of our institutions? And then where do we look across the state for other best practice models? I know that was a comment too, coming together to create some best practice models by learning from each other. And that's 2-year and 4-year, because our students are going to leave us. And for the most part, we have a huge transfer rate in Maryland, and students are going to expect that when they leave us, that they can move smoothly into that 4-year institution, particularly in this new environment that we're finding ourselves. K-12, when a student graduates from high school, they're going to expect that they can move smoothly into whatever their next post or their first post-secondary experience is. So I think it's pushing, but it's also recognizing across the board that we didn't get this right everywhere. So how do we take the time and pay the attention that it needs to getting us there? There is an expectation, much like many of you may belong to it. I follow this site, Higher Ed Coronavirus. And I will say this to you. They are the folks who tend to post regularly. I don't post, I just follow. But they are either giving leadership the highest of marks, or we are lower than a snake's belly around what the plans are for returning in the fall. And I think that, quite frankly, and just my own personal opinion, which I can give because in 35 days I'll be retired. And but I think that we just had a conversation here with our Vice President for Administrative and Financial Services, and I said, let's stop playing this game that somehow we're going to be back at work 100% sometime during the fall semester. Given everything that we're seeing, that is not going to happen. But at the same time, let's be clear about what our expectations are, because communications is so significant around these things, and then how we're talking to students about it. You know, we have questions like, well, how are you going to protect us from the community? Well, the issue is we serve the community. So what's our individual and collective responsibilities around making sure that people understand we expect you to wear a mask when you come over here. We expect these kinds of things. But when we tell students that you can go online and you can register for these courses and hear the definitions of them, then they ought to get what we're telling them they should have. And I think we all have to come together around that and just make sure, again, that there are standards and there is an expectation that every institution gets an MOL, seal of approval, if you meet these standards. So my suggestion is push us. Absolutely push us to get there. And then Secretary Fielder, our job is to push you.
I know that.
Right? And then to work collaboratively with the General Assembly and the Office of the Governor. All states are looking at this. We're not alone in this work, and there probably is some federal work that we could do together around this regarding this new environment. We will never go back. We will never go back. Let's not delude ourselves around this, and let's not hope for the days of old. It will not happen.
Thank you.
I can tell us that I need to talk to her one day before, when there's one day left versus 35, because I think she'll tell it like it is. And I love that. I love that. One thing that you mentioned was the need for the relationships between the sectors. And many of you know on this call that the NC SARA, which really got started in 2015, 14 in other states, 15 in Maryland, created a whole different relationship for the students of Maryland and residents of Maryland to be able to sign online and take courses from throughout the United States on hundreds of institutions. Well, that brought a couple of challenges. One, of course, the MHEC, meaning our responsibilities to review and register and verify each of those institutions are active members and are holding to a set of quality. I don't think that we've seen the true transferability of those courses yet at our four-year institutions. Likewise, the students that have been taking AP, dual enrollment, advanced placement, college and high school, all those things are articulation agreements, which needs to be further, not necessarily further reviewed, but further articulated in the sense that we talk about now a student at a community college will transfer their credits to a four-year. Well, I really think it should be called a continuation. You know, it's not going to be a transfer, it's a continuation, so that you sign an articulation agreement, you know that 100% of your credits will transfer. And at some point, as we continue to move forward with this online distance learning, we will get to that point that there will be increased standards, increased certifications for the 2 years and the 4 years to be able to accept the transfers of credits. So they're going to be simultaneous and stackable credits. So you take the credit at the high school level, Simultaneously, that becomes applicable, like the Promise Scholarship, to a 2-year or associate's degree. At the same way, it becomes applicable and transferable to a 4-year degree. So all these things, I think, now will be streamlined a little bit through the use of these technologies, and that very much, you know, raises the questions about standards and quality. You know, we're seeing right now for fall term, many institutions not only freezing tuition and fees, but eliminating the need for review of ACTs and SATs. We're also seeing the thing from nursing and student teachers and clinical review, the agreement for the boards to be much more flexible and amenable to accepting that student into the workplace. Well, I think that's going to trickle right down to high school students into 2-year, into 4-year. All these things are going to require increased articulation. And there is no, somebody said, well, what's the new normal? I don't think there's anything new and normal right now. Everything's new and improved. Some people will say it's not improved, but we are where we are.
Thank you. One of the things that, as I'm reflecting on the comments of both of you, and thank you so much for sharing, even in this conversation, we've talked a lot, and when I think about what we've talked about, we've really talked about our credit offerings. We haven't even touched upon all of the offerings on the non-credit workforce development side of the house, which in a lot of ways could be a whole separate panel discussion, because even, and I think this goes back to the comment about, you know, getting our vocabulary and our nomenclature, even as we're talking about what kinds of courses we're talking about, we've been pretty exclusively talking about our credit degree programs, but a lot of our institutions are relying on non-credit workforce development programs, and those are often even further behind some of the credit faculty, et cetera, in terms of their preparation and ability to provide those kinds of courses in a remote online kind of way. And I know we at Prince George's are still looking to find that total pivot of those non-credit courses. So I don't know if we have time for a question on that now, but I definitely think that there is, even inside of this conversation, some other sort of aspects of this sort of big issue that we haven't even touched upon.
Well, Rhonda, I will tell you that in the chat box, there are some agreements with you regarding that last statement that you made. And I think we're all looking at that. You know, there are some of us who believe you can teach swimming online, and others who believe that you can't. Well, the one thing we know is it's highly unlikely, at least on a college campus, that too many people are going to be jumping in the pools lately, no matter what's happening on on beaches around the United States. So I think you bring up a great point. You know, at Prince George's for a long time, we had a dual kind of reporting structure up through you when you were director of e-learning, around how do we pivot continuing education courses in an online environment. And for those that we could at the time, we would. But I also think we never paid as much attention to it as we could have. And again, this is a time in which we find ourselves where we're rethinking old decisions that were made. We're trying to think about how do we do it in a new and improved way as we think about the way forward around all of this? Or are there some courses that will never be able to be taught in that format, and we accept that, but we provide all of the physical and social distancing so that it can happen? But again, I would just say, and I know that our time is short, that you all are the experts. You know, you all will help us be responsible for the change that we're looking for. And I think that that's so important. Many of you know that you can come up through the community college structure to make recommendations. We can send that on to Secretary Fielder, or quite frankly, as a group, you can make recommendations, I would think, directly to the secretary about how we do this. And I know that we're capturing the comments in the chat line, but I'd like to see as a result result of this sort of short 60-minute conversation, some recommendations that would come forward, because we're all learning things at our institutions. And I can't believe that the learning is so significantly different that we couldn't come together with the set of recommendations that we can send forward. This is, I think what we're talking about is a better normal, but a normal that really engages this technological format in terms of teaching and learning. And what does it mean from, you know, the president, the senior cabinet, and our ability to support this, to talk about it, and to make some demands. Now, you know, in higher ed, it's hard to demand things. So we need to come to a collaborative decision around these kinds of things, using a form of collegial or shared governance and all of those kinds of things. But in the midst of all of that, what we have to remember is that our students don't have the same access to collegial and shared governance. They end up doing whatever we say that you will have to do. And we have to think about them in this process. Probably 1/3 of our students had zero access, and we serve just under 40,000 students. About 1/3 had zero access to technology or internet. We had continuing education students who had zero access to technology or internet. They were used to getting in their car and coming to the college. They were on fixed incomes, so they couldn't afford those kinds of things. How do we think, if education is going to be the great equalizer, it's time to make decisions that will make that become a fact as opposed to fiction.
This is not a paid advertisement, but I would say that the pandemic has surely shown the United States that over 24 million people are unemployed now, and the ones that are most greatly impacted are those with the least education, and the institutions that are in the grasp of changing that for those individuals are the community colleges, through licensure, through certificates, through non-credit coursework that needs to be examined. How do we beef that up? How do we put the people who want to be back to work in a fashion that they feel is more secure than what they have been doing? And these are real questions throughout the whole United States that need to be addressed, and not just addressed, but need to be acted upon. And then we're working on all those things, from youth apprenticeship programs to how do we expand to help students, again, have an articulation so they can clearly see where they're going. And if they choose to go on further, that's great. If they choose to change to something else, that's great also. But the community colleges are the ones that are the most nimble. And I think the 4 years are seeing that right now, and we will see even greater innovation coming from our 4-year institutions. And I second the motion that Dr. Dukes, I wasn't laughing when you were speaking. I was reading the comments that said, Dr. Dukes shouldn't retire,
Well, if it's any consolation, I do expect to stay in Maryland, and I do expect to be able to use my voice in ways that sometimes as the president, you might be a little constrained. So if I can help in any way, I'll be more than happy to.
I love that. That's great.
Well, we are out of time. This has been awesome. I feel like we could have talked for another hour and it would have gone by as fast as this pandemic time since we've been home did. Thank you each so much. Dr. Dukes, well, the sentiments in the chat, how much I'll miss you personally, but always look forward to your voice in Maryland. Thank you for all of your support for MOL, community colleges, the state of Maryland, higher education, and everything that you've done. Secretary Fielder, we look forward to continue to work with you.
Excellent.
And we have this recorded, so some of the things that you committed to, we'll be calling you on.
Oh my gracious, that means, okay.
Just kidding.
No, well, that's good. That's as it should be.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. The leadership that was demonstrated in this conversation is remarkable. It's been a challenging time for all of us, and we've learned so much through it. But having this conversation, this open dialogue, it reminds us of our purpose. It reminds us of why we're here. And the short takeaways that I come away with are, where we are and what can we do better. That's always what we ask as educators. Setting minimum standards for and including partnerships, and Secretary Fielder, engage versus endure. I faced this as I looked ahead with my kindergarten through 7th graders. What can I engage in? What can I endure? It was always a balancing act, and I think so many of us face that limitation, that eagerness to move forward, but that comfort in what we knew before. And then our smooth transition and communication. So I'm so grateful for everybody that joined us today. We had a very lively group, lots of questions, but I thank everybody for their time. I look forward to our continued partnerships going forward.
Thank you all, and all of you be safe. Bye-bye now.
Be
Take
well.
care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.